Greetings, I'm Bill Kladky, and I'd like to welcome you to today's edition of Neighborhood Beat. Our show today looks at fair housing in Maryland. Our guest is Debra McGhee, who's director of the Fair Housing Center for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's Maryland office. Debra, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bill. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, well, it's good to have you. It's good to have you. First of all, for our viewers who are unfamiliar, and I guess there are some, could you please tell us a little bit about HUD?
Oh, sure. I work for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and we work in many areas of providing housing opportunities for the country, but the part of HUD that I work for is responsible for enforcing the laws against discrimination. Now, federal law prohibits discrimination in any kind of housing transaction based on race, color, religion, national origin, familial status, and disability. And you might think, what's familial status? A lot of people don't know that. That means the presence of children under the age of 18 that are domiciled in the family. So it can be a foster child, it can be the number, if a person has difficulty acquiring housing because they have 4 children, and someone thinks that that's too many children to rent to. That could be a fair housing complaint. That is against the law. So you may not take these things into consideration: race, color, the number of children, the presence of children, or disability.
And in Maryland?
And in Maryland, the state of Maryland prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And I think that's a good thing, but the federal law doesn't cover that yet.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. How long have you been with HUD?
Oh, now you're embarrassing me.
Sorry.
Yeah, I've actually been with HUD for 20 years.
20 years,
yes,
Debra.
Yes. So, but I stay because it's fascinating. It is the most interesting job I could possibly have. And right now is such an exciting time. If you're interested in fair housing, this is the best time to be working for HUD and to be working right here in Baltimore. I love this community, and the things that are happening in this city and the surrounding counties are very exciting.
What's going on?
Okay, one thing is right now, and I know this is a little bit complicated, but stay with me, Bill. They're talking about affirmatively furthering fair housing. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that the city and the counties, Baltimore County, Anne Arundel, Howard County, they're working together, and the city of Annapolis, they're working together to plan to undo the patterns of segregation that have hardened in place over the many decades that we have dealt with issues of race discrimination and separation according to disability, according to income. It's a difficult task, and it takes a lot of it takes energy and courage and intellectual curiosity to really look at the situation, and they're looking at it across the whole region that surrounds Baltimore and asking themselves what they can do in terms of housing policy, in terms of the way they allocate money to create affordable housing, so that families at every income level have access to housing opportunities that let them live in a neighborhood where there are good schools, no crime or less crime, because there's never no crime, less crime, less blight. We talk to people, and we know this is true. People want to raise their children in a situation where that child is going to have friends of all different races and ethnicities, so that when they go out and work, they can deal with all kinds of people.
Right.
They're comfortable, they're culturally competent, and they're able to move comfortably in our multi-ethnic society. That's really important to people.
Everybody wins.
Everybody wins. And it is difficult. The segregation that we see didn't happen by accident. It was the law. It was the law.
Yeah. No.
It was the result of policies that organizations, that the government adopted, some industries, like the real estate industry and the lending industry, had policies that created these patterns intentionally. And so it didn't happen by accident, and it won't be undone by accident.
Yeah, but it is necessary, and it's necessary, as you've said, not only because of that individual family needing to and wanting to raise their children in a way that is the best for that child.
Right.
But also the fact that we all win by this. We have lower rates of crime, we have lower rates of poverty, we have lower rates of conflict between folks of different types. It's something folks, when they hear the word segregation or when they hear the word fair housing or discrimination, I don't think most of us understand really all that is affected by these terms.
Exactly, Bill. And for example, I can't give you too many details about this particular complaint. We're still working on it, but we're dealing with a complaint situation where an individual needed a reasonable accommodation because the housing that she was in had a mold problem and an infestation problem, and she had a child who was medically fragile, who was disabled. So this was a case where she had a disability and she was asking to be moved to different housing that was not infested with mold and so on. And her child was in and out of the hospital multiple times because of the way that this situation, his living environment interacted with his disability. And this went on for such a long time. That woman became so desperate, she tried to kill herself. And when they took her to the hospital, she talked about her housing situation and her child and her being unable to care for her family the way she wanted to. And that was, by HUD's definition, the failure to provide a reasonable accommodation that is necessary because of a disability is discrimination.
Yeah.
And in my work, we do investigations of housing discrimination complaints. And we see every day how potent this is for people, how critical it is for people to be able to obtain the housing that they need to take care of their children properly and to have a fair shake at life.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Could you give us some contact information for how folks can find out more about HUD and fair housing?
Absolutely, I'd love to do that. One way is to look online. HUD has a fantastic website. It's www.hud.gov, and there's all kinds of information about fair housing cases we've investigated and finished and what the results were, and what the law prohibits. That's a great website. Also, they can call my office in Baltimore if you have any kind of question about housing discrimination, if you think you've been discriminated against, or if you're a landlord and you don't want to be guilty of discrimination and you have a question, go ahead and call. We love to talk to people. It's 410-962-2520.
Okay. And you have an 800 number too?
We do. And so outside of Baltimore, anywhere in the country, you can call this 800 number, 1-800-6699-777. That's 800-6699-777.
Sounds like an easy one.
Yeah.
And it's free.
It's free. Right. We have HUD all over the country. We have offices. We have teams of investigators who are experts. If you believe you have been discriminated against, all you need to do, you can call us and we will take in the complaint and send an investigator to look at the situation, to interview people, to review records, and they will find out what happened. They can determine whether or not that individual actually experienced discrimination. If that individual experienced discrimination, we can take their case to court for them and achieve a remedy for them. And all of this is at no cost to the consumer.
Right. It's important to underline also that any kind of retaliation for filing a complaint is also illegal.
That is a very good point, yes. People are often afraid, and they don't want to be targeted. They're afraid to make waves where they live. I mean, it's very personal. And so it's important that the Fair Housing Act does prohibit retaliation on the basis of having filed a fair housing complaint.
Right, right. I tell folks, make the complaint if you don't have rights if you don't use your rights.
That's true.
Yeah, yeah.
That's true. And yes, we will give you an explanation of what happened. At the end of the day, we will tell you. We can go behind the scenes in a way that the individual cannot. Right. An interesting area that we've been doing investigations in recently is mortgage lending discrimination against women who are on maternity leave.
One would think that somebody on maternity leave would have a little bit of consideration, but apparently some folks do not.
I think that the lenders were, maybe it was unintentional in a way. They were
Let's hope that.
regarding this as a break in employment or income instability. And we found that when a family was seeking a mortgage and a member of that family was on paternity leave or maternity leave, they were likely to be told that they could not receive a mortgage until the person returned to work. Okay, so the department has addressed this in a couple of ways. We have a model policy that we ask lenders to adopt, and it requires that the lenders look at the family's total income and total assets and do definitely a responsible assessment of what the income into that household will be, because they do have to be able to make that mortgage payment. But just because somebody's on maternity leave does not automatically mean that they don't have sufficient income and resources to pay a mortgage.
Yeah, that's another thing that's totally unreasonable. I mean, I think most of us would say, well, I mean, unless you're on maternity leave for like decades.
Yes.
I mean, right. It doesn't make any sense. Huh?
That's right. And we've had situations, well, my office recently resolved a complaint where an individual had a difficult pregnancy and they were on maternity leave, but they actually received disability income throughout the entire period. But they were not, and as soon as they were no longer disabled, as the baby was, born and they were going back to work, they would have their other income, their regular income. They were unable to close the deal on their house and they suffered economic consequences. So we worked with that lender. I have to say that was a very cooperative lender, and they worked with us in good faith, and they have modeled their policy around the HUD policy, and they have paid that woman $13,000 to make up for the economic hardship she experienced when she couldn't close on her house.
Good. Is that someone we should give a little publicity for their good work?
Yes. Well, this was done in my office, and it was Rachel Leith and Phyllis Weinstein. Rachel's the branch chief, and Phyllis Weinstein was the investigator, and they did a bang-up job on that case working with that lender.
Yeah, that's wonderful. But if you have a question, I tell folks, give a call or go on the website and check out and get your questions answered, because it's free.
Yes, absolutely. You can call 410-962-2520 and speak to someone in Baltimore, or 1-800-6699-777.
Great, thank you. I know that HUD has recently issued some very interesting and updated regulations regarding several aspects of housing.
That's true. April was Fair Housing Month, and we celebrated, I think, by issuing some really important guidance. I think it's so good when we do this, because I believe that most of the realtors and developers and housing management companies want to be in compliance with the Fair Housing Act. And some of these issues are complicated, and people need the guidance. And the guidance that HUD issues is really down to earth. It's plain English. It's in question and answer form typically. So we issued guidance on how to interpret the design and construction requirements of the Fair Housing Act.
That's pretty technical.
I know, it sounds technical, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Now, Bill, do you think that most of your viewers realize that almost all the multifamily housing that is built in this country right now needs to be built so to be accessible to a person who's using a wheelchair?
I bet folks don't know that, yeah.
Yeah, it's true though, and this law has been in effect since 1991.
It's over 20 years.
It is. It's true. And it is really important for people to realize that. And we're all getting older. We could all need that kind of accessibility at any time.
Yes.
Right. So here's the thing. If a person were to visit a new property that is multifamily housing, condos, apartment complexes, it does not have to be federally funded. If it's any kind of multifamily housing, if it has an elevator, okay, that building should be generally accessible to people. It has to have an accessible entrance. You have to be able to have an accessible path down the hall and into the units.
That means a ramp. That means something that somebody in a wheelchair can get in comfortably.
That's what it means. You're right, and the doors have to be wide enough. And so I would say that anybody who visits a property and sees that this isn't in place, that a person in a wheelchair couldn't move around that property, they should call us. We would want to know if new properties are being constructed that are not accessible.
And unfortunately, the reason why you mention this is because a number are.
Yes.
That's the and what that means. I tell folks in terms of accessibility, you know, for folks with disabilities, you're just, if your business is not accessible, that's a bunch of customers that aren't going to come to your place.
That's true. It's true. And you never know. I mean, people can become, you may think that this doesn't apply to you, that you don't need these features in a building, but it could happen tomorrow. You know.
And your grandmother.
And your grandmother might want to visit you.
Right. And your father might want to, go to a store. What if your father can't get in?
Right.
What's he going to do?
Right, exactly. So
people need to think about the fact that we're really helping each other here. And we're not we shouldn't just look at questions of accessibility, for example, from our rather limited perspective. We should think about, could my mother, could my brother, could my grandmother get in here?
That's true.
And if they can't, then would you tell your grandmother that she can't go and pay her bill?
Right, exactly. That they call that visitability. They want, and so I think it's very good that this new guidance is out there and people can find it very easily if they Google, HUD design and construction guidance. It'll pop right up.
Great. And I know that, and this is another area that I know that there's been a lot of complaints and a lot of discrimination lately around the whole question of service animals. Could you please tell us about what the law is and what have you been seeing and how can people find out more?
Sure. This is an area that I think it's really important, and there is there's a little bit of controversy. People who have a disability oftentimes can be assisted by an animal. We all know about seeing eye dogs, but there are other kinds of assistance. People who have depression, people who have PTSD, veterans can be assisted oftentimes by having an animal that lives with them. Now, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, there's a rather narrow definition of a service animal. I think that's the definition that applies when we're talking about all kinds of public accommodations, buses, theaters, restaurants. That definition is really rather more narrow. But when we're talking about the Fair Housing Act, we talk about assistance animals. And in the Fair Housing Act, if a person needs an animal because of their disability, that animal does not have to be a dog. It could be a cat. It could be, I suppose, a parrot, it could be if they need the animal because of their disability, and if the animal assists them in coping with their disability, then they are required to be allowed to have that animal unless the animal poses an undue administrative or financial burden or poses an immediate threat to the other people in the building. Yeah.
So, in other words, if someone is in an apartment building,
Yes.
and they get disabled,
Right.
they get a disabled, and the apartment building has a no pets policy,
Right.
but they need say a service dog.
That's right.
That service dog is allowed to be there.
That's right.
Yeah.
And if they need a big dog, we've seen, I can remember a complaint from a woman who had a disability that caused her to become faint and collapse sometimes, and she also had anxiety, partly I think because of her somewhat more vulnerable physical condition, and she was anxious, and so having a large dog was really important to her. She leaned on the dog made her feel safe. Now, that dog, we can't have weight and breed restrictions applying to these service animals and assistance animals. Those animals, sometimes because of the disability, that person needs a particular kind of animal. Now, so we're talking about really people who have real disabilities, and that animal performs a real function for them. And so it's important to understand that can be critical. I can remember one of the early cases that the department prosecuted. It's called Durand Evans, and if your viewers were to look that up, that gentleman was willing to become homeless rather than face the loss of his cat. It's very, very important to people.
Yeah, and it's reasonable for a landlord to ask a tenant in that case to provide a doctor's note about that?
It is. It's reasonable for them to have the tenant provide documentation that they are in fact disabled, and that the animal performs a function that makes it easier, makes them able to function like a person without a disability within their living environment.
That makes sense.
Bill, it doesn't have to be a doctor, though. It could be anyone who is a professional who has reason to know about the disability, like a licensed clinical social worker, for example.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. I did want to ask you also about mortgages, because
Yes.
mortgages have been in the news. There have been a lot of problems with folks having mortgages. What's the latest in HUD regarding mortgages?
Right. Well, HUD is very alert to the possibility of predatory lending.
Yeah.
And to groups being targeted. I'm sure that you and I and your viewers know that there are parts of our community where perhaps there's a concentration of minorities, perhaps, by which I mean a lot of people who are African American and Hispanic, living all in one place, and there may be no banks. And a situation like that makes it very possible that people can be targeted for predatory lending products. And HUD has done a lot of work. One of the things that we've done is fund research into these issues. But we are aware that there are people who experience discrimination in that they are targeted by people who have a loan product that they know is predatory. They know that people who use this loan product to purchase a home are likely to default, and the home will be recouped. They know that people are being charged exorbitant interest and exorbitant fees, but they also know that there are no banks in that community, and they can target the community.
So they're forced really into going to the high interest firm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's a really critical problem, and it's something else that if people experience that, if they believe they've been targeted, they can certainly contact HUD, and we would look into their situation and do some research and see what's going on there.
Yeah, but once again, the only way to stop it is to complain about it.
That's right. That's right. And we try to make it not an onerous process for people.
Yeah, and I know that it's free, and the folks that answer the phone are friendly. I keep underlining that to folks, that, you know, you're not going to come up against somebody who's going to give you the fourth degree. They're going to ask you the necessary questions to find out about it.
Right.
But they're going to do it in a friendly way and in a way to help you.
Exactly, exactly. So I think that's a really critical point. And we have a whole team of people, and we're working with Baltimore Neighborhoods, Inc. We work with legal aid. So we do have resources to help people resolve their issues.
Yeah, yeah. That's important. That's important. And it's critical that HUD continue to do what it's doing. And I know that you folks have been affected by the sequester as well as everybody else.
We have.
But I know that it's important that folks keep in mind what we're talking about in terms of discrimination, in terms of segregation, and to remember that these are issues that not just affect the people that are discriminated against, they affect all of us.
I think that's right. I think that we're looking at building vibrant, healthy communities. And I want to say, in terms of the planners that I've talked to in the various counties, in Baltimore County, in Baltimore City, in Annapolis, Anne Arundel, the people that we're talking to are very interested in making sure that we have these communities where there is economic diversity, racial and ethnic diversity, and where people with disabilities have the opportunity to live in the least possible isolation.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I'm glad you folks are working on it. We're about out of time. Could you give us that contact information one more time, please?
Sure. Our contact information is 410-962-2520 to call the Baltimore HUD office, or 1-800-669-9777 to call the 800 hotline number. You can go to the HUD website, or, Bill, I forgot almost, there's an app. If you have an iPhone or an iPad, you can find an app that allows you to file a fair housing complaint. And it's just go to the App Store and ask for fair housing.
That sounds great.
So.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today in Neighborhood Beat. I want to thank our guest, Debra McGhee, who's director of the Fair Housing Center for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's Maryland office, for being our guest. Thank you, Debra.
Thank you. It was great, Bill.
Great. Keep up your good work for all of us.
Okay, thanks.
And for Neighborhood Beat, I want to thank you for tuning in. Let's try to be a good neighbor out there in all of our neighborhoods, and we'll see you next time.